The blaring alarm shattered the quiet of the frozen morning. Red lights flashed along the steel corridors of Outpost Sentinel 7. Their glow bouncing off the frosted windows. Outside, the temperature had plunged to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit overnight. The kind of cold that could freeze exposed skin in seconds. Colonel Rick Dawson pulled on his heavy parka, his breath coming in steady puffs of steam as he stepped out of his quarters. At 68, he moved with the precision of a man who had spent a lifetime in the military. His posture straight, his gait deliberate. His mind had been trained to react to threats before fully understanding them. But something about this situation didn't sit right. Years in the field had honed his instincts. They were the same instincts that had saved him in war zones across the globe. The same ones that had kept him alive in the brutal terrain of Afghanistan and the jungles of South America. And now, here, in the unforgiving wilderness of Alaska, they told him that this was no ordinary breach. The hallway was already filling with soldiers, men and women in thick combat gear, rifles slung across their chests, their boots thudding against the metal flooring. "What's the situation?" Rick barked as he approached the command center. Sergeant Lewis, a younger man with sharp features and frost clinging to his beard, turned to him, eyes filled with uncertainty. "Perimeter breach on the northern fence. Sir, motion sensors triggered at 0540 hours. We expected a human intruder. But..." He hesitated. Rick narrowed his gaze. "Spit it out, Sergeant. It's a bear, sir. A grizzly. A big one." Rick frowned. That didn't make sense. A perimeter breach was rare enough out here in the middle of nowhere. The base had been designed to withstand both man-made and environmental threats. Armed patrols ran routine sweeps, and the fences were reinforced with steel and razor wire. Not something an animal, no matter how large, could easily get through. "Show me," Rick ordered. The team moved quickly, following him to the central monitoring station. A cluster of screens displayed live security feeds from around the base. One of them, covered in static from the interference of the ongoing storm, showed the north perimeter fence, twisted metal, snapped wires, and there, in the middle of it all, a massive, dark shape. Rick leaned in, studying the bear. Even on the grainy footage, he could see that something was off. "It's not attacking," he noted. The bear wasn't charging the buildings or attempting to scavenge supplies. It wasn't behaving like a desperate, hungry animal. Instead, it stood still, its massive frame covered in a dusting of ice, its breath coming in slow, visible clouds. Its posture wasn't aggressive. If anything, it looked exhausted. "I need a team with me," Rick said, already turning toward the armory. "Sir, it could be dangerous," Lewis started. But Rick cut him off. "It breached our perimeter and didn't attack. I want to know why." Minutes later, bundled in layers of insulated military gear, Rick and a small team of armed soldiers moved cautiously toward the north perimeter. The storm had died down, leaving a haunting silence across the snow-covered landscape. The floodlights buzzed softly, illuminating the broken section of the fence. And there it was. The grizzly was even bigger up close, easily 800 pounds. Its fur thick with frost, its dark eyes locked onto Rick's approach. But it didn't charge, it didn't roar, it simply stood there, breathing hard. Rick had spent enough time in the wilderness to know an animal in distress when he saw one. This bear wasn't just lost, it was weak. "Hold fire," he ordered his men, raising a gloved hand. They lowered their weapons, though some still kept their fingers near the triggers. Rick took a slow step forward. He could hear his own heartbeat in the still air. The bear watched him but didn't move. Then Rick saw it, the wound. A long, jagged gash ran along the animal's hind leg, partially frozen over but still fresh. Blood, dark and sluggish, stained the snow beneath its massive paws. That explained how it had broken through the fence. A wounded animal, desperate and unable to outrun predators, had likely stumbled upon the base and pushed forward. Sheer survival driving it through barriers no healthy bear would have dared to approach. Rick exhaled, his breath curling in the cold air. The bear had come here because it had nowhere else to go. The silence stretched between them, man and beast, two old warriors who had fought their own battles, who had seen their share of pain and struggle. Rick knew what had to be done. "We're not shooting it," he said firmly. The soldiers exchanged glances. "Sir," one of them asked. "You heard me," Rick said, his voice leaving no room for argument. The bear wasn't a threat. It was a survivor, just like him. He knew what it felt like to be pushed to the brink. To be battered by forces beyond your control and still press forward because there was no other choice. He made his decision. "Sergeant, get me a tarp and some medical supplies. We're going to patch it up as best we can and get it moving back into the wild." There was hesitation, but no one questioned his order. Rick moved carefully, grabbing a blanket from his pack and tossing it toward the bear. It landed in the snow a few feet away. The bear didn't react immediately, but after a moment, it took a single step forward, its heavy paw pressing into the snow. Then another step, It was slow, deliberate, but it was moving. Good. By the time the supplies arrived, Rick knew what needed to be done. They would clean the wound as best they could, provide some food to give it strength, then guide it away from the base before it became too accustomed to human presence. It wasn't standard protocol, but neither was this bear. Rick had spent his life making hard calls, deciding who lived and who didn't, following rules that dictated how survival worked. But sometimes, rules had to be bent. Sometimes, even a grizzled old soldier could recognize that the toughest warriors came in all forms. And as he stood there, watching the great beast take another slow step forward, he couldn't help but feel a strange, quiet understanding settle over him. Maybe, just maybe, they weren't all that different after all. The wind had settled into an eerie stillness, leaving only the distant hum of the outpost's perimeter alarms still flashing red against the endless white of the Alaskan wilderness. The men stood ready, weapons trained, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air. But Colonel Rick Dawson didn't call for an attack. He just watched. The grizzly stood motionless, its massive frame covered in frost, breath heaving in slow, labored clouds. It had made it through the steel perimeter, an impossible feat for most creatures, but it didn't charge. Didn't snarl, didn't show the usual aggression of a wild animal feeling cornered. Instead, it lowered its head. A sound came from its throat, not a growl, not a threat. It was low, broken, more of a whimper than anything else. Rick narrowed his eyes. "Sir," a voice came from behind him. He turned slightly as Sergeant Mark Sullivan stepped forward, lowering his rifle. At 54, Sullivan wasn't as hardened as some of the younger soldiers, but what he lacked in battlefield experience, he made up for with knowledge of the land. He had spent years tracking wildlife, monitoring predator patterns in Alaska before joining the base as their resident expert. He had seen countless bears before, but never one acting like this. "She's not here to attack," Sullivan said, voice steady. "She's looking for something." Rick didn't answer, but his instincts were already telling him the same thing. Sullivan stepped closer, eyes scanning the bear with practiced precision. Then, suddenly, he froze. "Sir," he said, his voice quieter now, "she's lactating." Rick turned sharply. "What?" Sullivan pointed. "She's still producing milk. That means she has cubs, or had them." A heavy silence settled over the men. There were no cubs in sight. That wasn't normal. A mother bear would never leave her young unless something had gone terribly wrong. And now, here she was, standing before them, not in rage, not in hunger, but in something else, something no one had ever expected. "She's asking for help," Sullivan said. Rick exhaled, watching the bear carefully. He wasn't the kind of man who assigned human emotions to animals. But there was something in the way she stood, something in the way she had watched the base, pacing through the night, hesitant but determined. The security footage had shown it all. Her movements weren't random. She had been here long before she breached the fence, circling, searching, waiting for a moment to approach. Rick turned to Sullivan. "Show me the camera feeds." Minutes later, they were inside the monitoring station, watching the grainy, time-stamped footage from the night before. The soldiers murmured quietly as they watched the mother bear moving through the darkness. Just outside the perimeter, she had walked back and forth, stopping near the fence, pausing, sniffing, then retreating, again and again, for hours. "This isn't normal," Sullivan muttered. "She wasn't scavenging. She wasn't trying to break in. She was trying to figure out how to approach without scaring anyone." Rick didn't speak. He just stared at the screen, watching the bear's slow, methodical movements. An animal's first instinct was always survival. Fear and aggression ruled most wild creatures, especially apex predators like grizzlies. But this one had been watching them, waiting. "She's exhausted," Sullivan continued. "Look at her movements. Slow, dragging, her fur's frozen stiff. And those tracks outside, she's been pacing for hours before she even tried to push through the fence." Rick turned back toward the window, where the bear still stood outside in the cold, head lowered, body swaying slightly with fatigue. "She's looking for her cubs," he said finally. Sullivan nodded. "Or looking for someone to help her find them." Rick took a slow breath. He had been in the military long enough to know that not everything could be explained in neat, logical terms. He had seen war, had seen men do impossible things to save their own. And now, in the middle of this frozen wasteland, he was staring at something just as rare. A mother, desperate to protect what she had lost. He turned to his men. "We need to check the area. Now." "Sir." One of the soldiers hesitated. "Search for tracks. Anything that might tell us where she came from." The team didn't hesitate this time. Within minutes, a scouting group was outside, scanning the snow-covered ground for any sign of movement. The wind had begun to pick up again, erasing tracks as quickly as they had been made. But Sullivan was already on his hands and knees, brushing aside fresh powder to reveal what lay beneath. "Here," he called. Rick moved beside him, staring down at the faint, barely visible markings, smaller prints, cub prints, and they were leading away from the base. She was following these, Sullivan murmured, but they split off. Something must have spooked them. Rick turned back toward the bear. She was watching them, her massive form still as a statue. She came here because she lost them. Sullivan continued, looking back at the tracks. She doesn't know where to go next. Rick let out a breath, glancing toward the storm clouds gathering in the distance. Time was running out. He made his decision. Take a squad. Follow those tracks. Find them if they're still alive. Sullivan nodded without hesitation. As the men moved out, Rick stayed behind, watching the bear. She still hadn't moved, her breath curling in the cold air, her muscles trembling from exhaustion. But there was something different in her eyes now. Hope. And for the first time in a long time, Rick felt something stir deep in his gut. He had spent his whole life making decisions in war, choosing which battles to fight, when to strike, when to hold the line. But this was something else. This was a different kind of battle. And if the bear was willing to fight for her cubs, then so was he. The wind cut through the outpost like a frozen blade, howling against the steel walls as Colonel Rick Dawson stood in the command center, staring at the security monitors. Outside, the mother grizzly still stood near the perimeter, her breath curling in the bitter air, her body swaying from exhaustion. The tracks Sullivan had found were real. The cubs were out there, somewhere in the unforgiving Alaskan wilderness, their survival hanging by a thread. Rick knew better than anyone what the rulebook said. Leaving the base to track an animal was reckless. It was a tactical risk, an unnecessary deviation from protocol. His 40 years in the military had drilled into him the importance of discipline, of measured decision-making, of never exposing his men to unnecessary danger. The safe call, the logical call, was to let the bear go. Nature would take its course. But as he watched the massive animal, something in him refused to accept that answer. "You're really considering this?" Lieutenant Parker's voice cut through the tense air. The younger officer stood rigid, arms crossed, his face set in a skeptical frown. "Sir, with all due respect, this isn't our mission. We don't risk lives for wildlife." Rick turned to face him, his steel gray eyes unreadable. "We don't abandon a mother looking for her children." Parker scoffed. "It's a bear, not a soldier." Rick's jaw tightened. "It's a mother." The room fell silent. Sergeant Mark Sullivan, still covered in frost from the search outside, took a step forward. "Sir, I've seen cases like this before. If she's lactating and still searching, it means the cubs are alive, at least. They were not long ago. They might be injured, lost. If we don't move now, they won't make it." Parker shook his head. "And what if this is just nature taking its course? We don't interfere with the wild." Rick exhaled slowly, glancing back at the monitor. He had seen what happened when protocol took precedence over instinct. He had seen it in war, good men hesitating because they were waiting for orders that came too late. He had made those calls before, calls that left men behind. Not this time. He turned back to the room. "I'm taking a team out." Parker's eyes widened. "Sir, that's against base security procedures." "I know damn well what it is." Rick cut in sharply. "This is my call." The tension in the room thickened. No one spoke for a long moment. Then, Sullivan nodded. "I'm in." Rick's gaze swept over the soldiers gathered in the command center. "I need 4 more, volunteers only." A beat of hesitation. Then, one by one, hands rose. Corporal Jenkins, an expert tracker. Sergeant Owens, a hardened veteran who had spent years in Arctic survival training. Private Mendez, the team's best marksman. And Lieutenant Hayes, a combat medic. Rick gave a firm nod. "Gear up. We move in 10. The team moved quickly, donning cold weather survival gear, strapping on rifles, packing essential supplies, rope, flares, emergency rations, and a med kit. They weren't just walking into the snow unprepared. If they were doing this, they were doing it right. As they stepped out of the barracks, the cold hit them like a hammer. The Alaskan wilderness stretched ahead, white and endless, the storm clouds gathering on the horizon. The mother bear still stood near the perimeter, watching them, waiting. She knew. Rick took the lead, his boots crunching through the deep snow. The team followed in silence, weapons slung but ready. They weren't just tracking a bear. They were stepping into the unknown. Sullivan crouched near the faint cub tracks, his gloved hand brushing over the barely visible indentations. They headed northwest, he muttered, could be following the scent of their den, or just wandering blind. Rick glanced at the horizon. If they had gone too far, if they had been separated for too long, the cold would do what predators hadn't. The mother bear turned, as if sensing their movement, and began walking in the same direction. "She's leading us," Owens murmured. Rick nodded, but he kept his guard up. This was a gamble, a calculated risk. Wild animals were unpredictable, no matter how desperate they were. They moved in a staggered formation, keeping their distance but following the bear's slow, deliberate pace. Every now and then, she would pause, sniff the air, Then keep moving. The deeper they went, the thicker the snow became, making progress slow and grueling. Then, after nearly an hour of trekking, Sullivan stopped abruptly. There, he whispered. Ahead, just beyond a cluster of wind-battered pines, was a dark shape half buried in the snow. Rick's heart tightened. A cub. The team moved quickly but cautiously, fanning out as they approached. The small bear lay curled in the snow, its fur stiff with ice, its breathing shallow. Sullivan knelt beside it, his hands moving with careful precision. It's still alive, he confirmed. Rick exhaled, relief washing over him for just a moment. But it was short-lived. Where's the second one? Jenkins asked. The mother bear sniffed the air, then let out a low, mournful sound. Sullivan was already scanning the ground. The tracks split here, he muttered. The second cub kept going. Rick made a decision. Jenkins, Sullivan, get the first cub stabilized. Owens, Mendez, with me, we find the second. They moved quickly, their breath harsh in the frozen air. The storm was closing in, the wind picking up again, biting against their exposed skin. Then Owens called out, tracks lead down that ridge. Rick followed the direction he pointed. A steep, icy slope led downward into a ravine. Rick didn't hesitate. He descended carefully, his boots digging into the snow, his balance steady. At the bottom, half hidden beneath the snow and tangled undergrowth, was the second cub. It wasn't moving. He moved fast, kneeling beside it, brushing off the frozen layer of snow. The tiny bear shivered faintly at his touch. Still alive. Barely. No time, Rick muttered. He reached for his radio. Sullivan, get the first cub back to base. We've got the second. Slinging his rifle over his shoulder, Rick lifted the cub into his arms. It was light, barely a fraction of its mother's weight, its fur brittle with ice. He cradled it close to his chest, his own body heat providing what little warmth he could. They climbed back up the ridge, where the mother bear stood waiting, her eyes locked onto him, onto the small, trembling bundle in his arms. Rick didn't flinch. Slowly, carefully, he knelt and placed the cub down in the snow. The mother stepped forward. The tension in the air was thick, every soldier gripping their rifles just in case. But there was no aggression. She lowered her head, sniffing her lost cub. A soft, guttural sound escaped her, almost gentle. Then, carefully, she nudged the cub closer to her chest, her massive form curling around both of them, shielding them from the cold. Rick stepped back, exhaling slowly. They had done it. No orders, no rules, just instinct, just survival. And as the storm raged in the distance, he realized something. Not all battles were fought with weapons. Some were fought with something even stronger. Compassion. The storm was relentless. Snow swirled in thick, blinding waves, each gust of wind cutting through the rescue team like a blade. Colonel Rick Dawson tightened his scarf around his face, his breath forming ice on the fabric. The world around them had vanished into a white abyss, the ground nearly indistinguishable from the sky. But they kept moving. They had no choice. The mother bear led the way, her massive form barely visible through the snow. What struck Rick wasn't just that she was moving forward, she was moving with them. Every so often, she would stop, turn her head, and look back, her dark eyes scanning him as if making sure they were still following. That's not normal, Sullivan muttered beside him, his voice barely audible over the wind. No, Rick agreed, watching the bear's deliberate pace. It's not. Wild animals didn't slow down for humans. They didn't check to see if people were still following. They didn't lead like this. But this mother bear was different. She wasn't running. She wasn't trying to lose them. She was making sure they were with her, every step of the way. She knew. Rick had spent decades in combat, leading men through war zones, relying on instinct honed by experience. He had learned to read situations, to see beyond the obvious, to recognize when an enemy was unpredictable. But this wasn't an enemy. This was something else entirely. She's trusting us, Sullivan murmured. She's actually trusting us. Rick said nothing. He just pressed forward. The terrain grew treacherous as they moved deeper into the wilderness. Rocks jutted from beneath the snow. Hidden ice threatened to take their footing. The cold had already seeped into their bones, numbing fingers even through insulated gloves. They pushed on, hour after hour. The mother bear led them, always slow, always steady, always looking back. Then, after what felt like an eternity, she stopped. Rick signaled for his men to hold position. The wind howled around them, but the mother bear wasn't looking at them now. She was staring down at something ahead. Rick moved forward cautiously, eyes narrowing against the snow. Then he saw it, a hole in the ground, nearly 20 feet across, partially buried under layers of ice and snow. It was deep, at least 15 feet down, maybe more, an old mining shaft. Rick's gut twisted. He knew Alaska's history well, long before the military established Outpost Sentinel-7. Before even the small frontier towns dotted the land, this region had been a battleground for gold rush prospectors. When the mining boom ended, The earth had been left scarred with abandoned shafts, forgotten tunnels, and pits just like this one, deep, deadly, and nearly impossible to escape once trapped. And at the bottom, barely visible through the shadows, were the cubs, two small, fragile forms huddled together, their fur coated in ice, their bodies barely moving. Sullivan sucked in a breath. Jesus. Rick scanned the edges of the hole, and his heart clenched. The snow had been disturbed. Claw marks raked against the ice-covered rock, deep gouges lining the sides of the pit. The mother bear had been trying to save them. For days. Rick exhaled slowly, taking it all in, the signs of her desperate struggle, the sheer impossibility of what she had tried to do. She had clawed, dug, scraped a frozen rock with nothing but instinct and desperation driving her. But she had been powerless against the pit. So she had done the only thing she could. She had gone looking for help. Rick turned to his men. "We're getting him out." No one argued. Jenkins was the first to move. Unpacking the rescue rope, Owens and Mendez braced against the edge, securing the line to a sturdy rock formation. Sullivan grabbed his field medkit, his face set in grim determination. Rick took one last look at the mother bear. She was watching him. She wasn't growling, wasn't pacing, wasn't trying to interfere. She was waiting. She was trusting. Rick pulled off his rifle, slung it over his back, and grabbed the rope. "I'm going down first." With a firm grip, he rappelled into the darkness of the pit. The cold intensified as he descended. The walls of the shaft were slick with ice, the air heavy with the scent of damp earth and old stone. When his boots hit the bottom, he crouched low, moving slowly so he wouldn't spook the cubs. Up close, they were smaller than he had imagined, barely more than fur-covered bundles. One of them trembled slightly at his presence, but the other was completely still. Rick reached out carefully, feeling for a pulse against the thin layer of ice coating its fur. Faint. Too faint. "We don't have time," he called up, the smaller ones barely holding on. Sullivan's voice came back instantly. "Get them in the harness. We'll pull them up." Rick wasted no time. He secured the first cub in the rope cradle, signaling for the team to hoist it up. The little bear let out a weak noise as it rose into the air, disappearing over the edge. The second cub, the weaker one, barely moved as Rick wrapped it in the harness. He tightened the rope, gave the signal, and watched as it too disappeared into the snow-filled sky. Then he climbed. By the time he reached the top, Sullivan was already working. The stronger cub had been wrapped in a thermal blanket, its shivering slowing. But the second cub, its breaths were too shallow, its body dangerously still. Rick knelt beside it. He could feel the mother bear's presence just feet away. She was restless now, shifting from paw to paw, watching, waiting. He unzipped his heavy jacket. Without hesitation, he pulled the freezing cub against his chest, wrapping the thick insulation around its small body. It was risky, but if there was any chance at all to warm it, to keep it breathing, he would take it. Minutes passed. Then, a breath, faint, but stronger than before. Sullivan exhaled sharply. "It's still with us." Rick nodded, standing slowly. Then, with deliberate movements, he unwrapped the cub and set it down. The mother bear stepped forward. For a moment, everything was still. Then she nudged her cub, sniffing at the small, shivering body. The other cub stumbled toward her, pressing against her warmth. And then, something no one expected. The mother bear lifted her head. She looked at Rick, not with fear, not with aggression, something else, understanding. Then, carefully, she nudged her cubs forward, wrapping them against her massive form, shielding them with her body. Rick took a step back. No one spoke. The wind howled around them. But in that moment, nothing else mattered. They had saved them. Rick had spent a lifetime making decisions, following orders, enforcing the rigid structure of military discipline. But this moment had never been in the rulebook. And as he watched the mother bear lead her cubs away, their small forms disappearing into the snowy wilderness, he knew one thing. Some battles weren't about winning. Some were about doing what was right. And tonight, they had done just that. The wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the biting chill of the Alaskan wilderness. Snow swirled in the air, cutting visibility to only a few feet. But Colonel Rick Dawson barely noticed. His focus was locked on the abandoned mining shaft in front of him, and the two cubs trapped at the bottom. The mother bear stood several yards away, her massive body stiff, her breath curling in thick clouds. She wasn't moving toward them. She wasn't growling. She was waiting. Rick had seen war, had led men into battles where the line between life and death was razor thin. But this moment, right here, felt just as critical. He turned to his team, their faces tense but determined. "We do this fast and clean," he ordered, his voice cutting through the wind. "Jenkins, set up the pulley system. Owens, you're going down first." Sergeant Owens, a veteran of Arctic operations, nodded grimly as he pulled the rope harness tight. He was the lightest among them, and with his experience in high-altitude rescues, He was the best choice to descend into the pit. Minutes later, the pulley was secured, the rope tested for weight, and Owens was lowered slowly into the abyss. Rick held the line steady, his gloved hands firm against the frozen cord. Almost there, Owens called up. Rick peered over the edge. The first cub lay curled up, its small body shivering violently. The second cub, barely moving, was in far worse shape. Owens reached the first cub and carefully wrapped it in a thermal rescue blanket. The little bear stirred slightly at the touch. A good sign. Pulling up now, Rick signaled, and the team began hoisting Owens and the cub upward. Inch by inch, the mother bear let out a low, deep sound, a sound not of anger, but something else, anticipation. As soon as Owens cleared the edge, the cub was unwrapped and placed on the snow-covered ground. The mother bear stepped forward. Every soldier tensed, but instead of aggression, she lowered her head and gently sniffed the cub. A deep, rumbling exhale escaped her. Then she lifted her gaze, not at her cub, but at the men standing nearby. She was waiting again. Rick's breath tightened in his chest. It was unmistakable. She knew. She's giving us a chance. Sullivan murmured in disbelief. Rick didn't hesitate. Second cub's critical. We're going back in. Owens was still catching his breath from the first descent. Sir, I can go again, but... No time. Rick cut in. I'm going. There were no objections. Rick had spent his life following protocols, leading missions that adhered to strict military doctrine. But at this moment, there was no doctrine, no handbook, only instinct, only survival. He secured the rope around himself, gripping the pulley as the team lowered him down. The darkness swallowed him, the icy walls closing in as he descended into the pit. Then he saw the second cub. It wasn't moving. Rick landed hard, his boots sinking into the snow-packed ground. He crouched immediately, pressing a gloved hand against the tiny chest. Faint breathing, still alive. He called up, barely, carefully. He scooped the cub into his arms. It was lighter than it should have been, its fur crusted with ice, its tiny body limp against his chest. Rick wasted no time wrapping it in the thick, heat-reflective rescue blanket, pulling the edges tight. Then, the worst possible thing happened. The ground beneath him shifted. A sickening crack echoed through the shaft. Shit, Rick muttered. Sir, Sullivan's voice came from above. The mine's unstable, Rick barked. We need to go, now. He secured the cub tightly against his chest. Pull me up. The rope jerked, and he felt the first tug of upward movement. Then the ground gave way. The lower half of the pit collapsed, rock and ice tumbling into the void below. Rick's stomach lurched as his legs dangled over nothing but darkness. His grip tightened around the cub, his fingers digging into the rescue blanket. Above him, the team pulled harder. The rope strained, the pulley groaned. For a moment, Rick wasn't sure if it would hold. Then, inch by inch, he was lifted upward, his boots scraping against the collapsing walls of ice. He clenched his jaw, muscles burning, focusing only on keeping the cub secure. Then, suddenly, hands gripped his arms. Owens and Sullivan hauled him over the edge just as the rest of the shaft caved in, swallowing the pit in an avalanche of snow and rock. For a moment, no one spoke. Rick exhaled hard, the freezing air burning his lungs. His arms trembled from exertion, but he didn't loosen his hold on the cub. He forced himself to his knees, unwrapping the blanket. A tiny, shivering breath. Still alive. Rick turned and gently set the cub down near its sibling. The mother bear stepped forward. She made no sound, no movement of aggression, only quiet, deliberate steps as she lowered her head and sniffed both cubs. Then, in a move that silenced every man watching, she gently nudged them closer to her with her massive nose. She looked at them. Then, she looked at Rick. The world around them was silent. No howling wind, no crackling ice, only the soft sound of breathing. Rick stared into the bear's dark eyes. He had spent a lifetime leading men into battle, standing in war rooms, making the kinds of decisions that determined who lived and who died. He had faced down enemies who were ruthless, unpredictable, but in this moment, he wasn't looking at an enemy. He was looking at something he didn't quite have words for. Understanding. After several long seconds, the mother bear turned. She nudged her cubs forward, urging them to follow. They stumbled at first, still weak, but they obeyed. The three figures disappeared into the trees, their tracks pressing deep into the snow. No one spoke as they watched them vanish. Sullivan was the first to break the silence. Sir, did that just happen? Rick took a slow breath. Yeah, he said quietly. It did. That night, as the storm settled and the outpost lights flickered against the snow. Rick sat alone, staring into the darkness beyond the perimeter. The bear would be out there somewhere. Maybe he'd never see her again. Maybe she and her cubs would vanish into the wilderness, as wild creatures were meant to. But then again, maybe not. And sure enough, in the years that followed, soldiers stationed at Outpost Sentinel 7 reported occasional sightings. A mother bear with two cubs, watching from the edge of the tree line. They never ventured too close, never threatened, and they never ran. Rick never spoke of that night in official reports. It didn't belong in military records. It belonged to something else entirely. Something beyond rules. Something beyond words. A quiet, undeniable truth, etched in the snow, in the wind, in the silent understanding between man and beast. He would never forget.
Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, please comment 1. And if you didn't, just hit like. See you in the next videos.